Hey everyone, and welcome. I'm Susan Smith. We're in my studio, Stitched by Susan, and we're having a casual chat about quilty topics. So I am a long arm quilter, mostly freehand, mostly edge to edge. That's the kind of stuff I love. But for a month, I've kind of lost track of which day is which, but I'm pretty confident we've actually been over 30 days. I've been coming onto YouTube Live each day for just a casual discussion about topics that relate to machine quilting. Sometimes about threads, sometimes about batting, sometimes about floating atop on the long arm. And today's topic is going to be backings, and specifically creatively pieced or spliced or found fabric type backings. So distinct from going to the quilting shop and buying specific backing for your project. So just some of the creative things that I've done and that I've seen, and some ideas, and maybe even some what not to use ideas, and my reasoning for why. So let's check in with a few of you before we dive into the topic. Mindy, I'm here sewing and waiting from a cool drizzly Texas. Wendy in Texas also. Good subject today. Good. I'm glad this is hitting a pain point. Donna, Sue, let's see. Sue Leftwich, this is a great subject for me. The backing depends on the purpose of the quilt, whether it's for a show or a cuddle quilt. Either way, I want the back to be nice also. Yes, there's so many considerations and so many ways you can go. So I just want to talk about a few of those today. Tracy, as a long arm quilter, I prefer 108-inch wide backings or one seam horizontally. So much easier for loading and quilting. It's true, that is the easiest, the two easiest ways to have backing. But it's honestly not always practical, and I'm going to talk about one of mine that's in progress today that has more seams than that. Donna, me too. If a client wants to use a sheet, I refuse to do it while trying to change his or her mind. We'll be talking about sheets today, Donna. I might be able to change your mind. Mindy, not had anyone bring a sheet, but I've had lots of pieced backs and they are never square. That is sadly so often true, Mindy. And honestly, what's worse than not square is not flat. So areas that pull up a little tighter than other areas, that can be incredibly, incredibly difficult. Lots of wonky bias places. Yep. Laura, hello. Marion, Janice, Gretchen, awesome. Debbie Fleming. Teresa, Karen, vanilla yogurt, another Teresa. Donna, again, I'm trying to scan the comments while I go just to greet you and also to see if you're putting questions or pithy comments in those messages. Joelle, vanilla yogurt, I've used sheets many times with great success. Happy to hear that. Elaine, Anne, Lynn, in New Zealand, awesome. Spring here, but chilly still. And also probably afternoon for you too, maybe even evening by now. Vicky, another person from New Zealand, great. Let's show Susan some love. Elaine, you're always such a cheerleader. Hit the thumbs up button. I do appreciate that. When you press like a time or two or three throughout the episode, it just helps it to be seen by more people. Lissa, snowing every day in Colorado, 28 degrees. We had a very cold night overnight too. My sweet potato plants in my pots are gone. So that'll be hopefully this afternoon's project to clean up. Angie, Annette, Debbie, I searched the clearance rack. It's great quilt shop quality fabric, and if I can find something I like, yep, absolutely. Yeah, there's lots of comments and wisdom already coming out in here, and I'm not going to be able to cover it all because it's just going to be a short chat. But let me give you a few ideas. So number one, talking about pieced backs. Let me show you one of mine. I've got to bend down to pick it up because it's a big quilt. This quilt is more than queen sized, and so when I went to choose a backing for it, let me just make sure my mic is on. Yeah, it is. When I went to choose a backing for it, if I was going to go by yardage, I was looking at 9 or 10 yards or meters of fabric, depending on what country you're in. That's a lot of fabric, and that is a pretty significant price tag. So then I went looking at my stash. What do I have? Well, not surprisingly, I don't have 9 or 10 yards of really anything, but I found 2 fabrics that I liked with the quilt top that were pleasing to me, and I had some of each. So here's the front of the quilt. It's kind of these 30s reproduction, very scrappy type fabrics, right? So on the backing, I had this pink soft print, and I found one that I had about 6 yards of. Can you see it there? There we go. Kind of cream colored, kind of whimsical, suits the front, right? I thought all pink was just overkill, so though I had other pinks in my stash, I chose not to put them together. I chose to use these two quite different fabrics. But here was my trick for making it not look chopped in half. I didn't want it to look like I ran out of one fabric and put the other one on. I wanted it to look on purpose, right? So I did what I call a zipper back. Can you see that? And my squares were huge. Usually I do this on a smaller quilt and therefore a finer scale, if you will. And basically all I did was cut a strip of each of the fabrics, sew them together, and then subcut them crossways, and then put those end to end. So I just had one print the other in squares. And then I sewed that between my two fabrics. And you just get this slight blending where the fabrics join up. I've done that lots of times for baby quilts also, because sometimes one width of fabric is not quite enough. I wish I had 6 or 8 inches more. Hate to go by a whole additional length, right? So you can put something in and zipper it, even if they're two quite different fabrics. You can zipper that blend and have your two fabrics in there. And it just extends, and you'll often have one or both of those pieces in your stash. So an easy way to extend your backing. And the large scale zipper seam is really cool. I think I cut these squares 6 inches. I more commonly do 4. I think the effect is better when it's a little bit finer, but I went with simple on this one. I didn't want to spend a lot of time either piecing my backing, and it is like a 90-inch quilt. So there is still, when you see it as a whole, there's still a lot of squares, and it does that nice zippering quite nicely. Elaine, I had the question about ripped versus cut backing. Oh my goodness, this quilt rolled beautifully. It was great. I'm so glad. So you're meaning one that you had torn, the edges torn instead of the edges cut, rolled beautifully is what you're saying? I certainly do have lots of clients that do tear their backings, and it seems to work just fine. Listen, what a great idea, zippered back. I'll have to try the zippered technique. One of these days I'll make a YouTube episode about it. I was thinking about it this morning as I was planning what I was going to say, and I thought, you know, if I made a YouTube episode for all the ideas I have for episodes, I'd have to quit everything else and just make YouTube episodes. Maybe one day I'll do that. So I do have a ton of ideas, and I don't always get around to them, but at least you have a sampling. And if you do a fair bit of quilt making, I bet you can figure that one out. My biggest takeaway, I think, is to scale the size of those squares to the size of a quilt. I would not do 6-inch squares on a baby quilt. I would do 4 or maybe even 3.5 or 3, you know, and for my big queen size or king size quilt, the 6-inch squares go a lot faster. So you just cut your strips the same width you want your squares to be, plus seam allowances, and then, you know, do the subcutting. You guys can figure that out. Okay, let's talk sheets. This is a favorite topic of mine. I've showed you before, those of you who have watched regularly, and if you haven't seen them before, you can go back to one of the earliest ones in this month of daily episodes, and I did a little trunk show of my quilting heritage, my mother, grandmother, etc. At least one of them that was made by my mom had a blue, like a white background with blue roses, floral, for the backing of the quilt. That was a sheet. My mom did that a ton. Bought flat sheets inexpensively on sale, and the single flat sheet would become the backing for a quilt. The ones that she used typically had a poly cotton blend in them, which again, quilters sometimes turn up their noses at. It's got to be all cotton. But the truth is my mom did that over and over and over, and 50 years later, I'm still using that quilt, and it's still standing the test of time. So in my opinion, I don't really care if it's a mixed content backing. What it might affect, if this matters to you, is the level of shrinkage. So if your top, for example, is made of 100% cotton quilting fabrics, it's going to shrink a little bit. And if your backing is made of a poly cotton blend, it's probably not going to shrink a little bit. However, when the top shrinks, the whole thing will still get crinkly, in my opinion, right? But that is one of the things you might want to consider. I do have a resource that I found a couple years ago. There's a lady in Spokane, Washington, where I live, and she must do garage sales and estate sales all year long. And then once a year, she opens her shop doors and has a garage sale of all these textiles, not necessarily quilting related. There's a lot of like crochet and embroidery and things like that too. But among her piles, I can almost always find some sheets. This is one of them. Like, isn't that nice? To me, that is a super quilt backing. And this one happens to have the tag still attached, and it happens to be 100% cotton, which they aren't always. Here's the thing though about sheets for backings, and this is why some quilters object. newer sheets, like more recently made sheets, tend to have, I should say it a different way. Marketing now, they're always trying to sell us sheets that have a high thread count because they feel good on your skin. That tight weave, 4 or 6 or 800 threads per square inch feels very satiny and smooth, but it's not ideal for quilting. That provides a lot of resistance for your needle going through, and when you're doing fast and many stitches, those high thread counts are not a good choice for quilting. So I think that's why you hear a lot of quilters say, I'm not using sheets as a backing. And I agree with them insofar as those high thread count sheets, they're difficult to work with. Like, I'd be surprised if you could get a decent tension and a decent stitch look out of those. But these older sheets and or cheaper sheets that have a lower thread count, 250 used to be super common, and they work perfectly well. I've bought lots of brand new a dozen 250 thread count sheets and used them very successfully as backings on quilts. So I think taking that thread count into consideration is a major point in whether or not you're going to accept quilts. So think of that when you've got clients that want to have a sheet. Maybe you could put that specification in there. Well, okay, I'll use a sheet, but text me what it is that you're wanting to buy, and it's got to be, 250 threads per inch or less or something like that to try and keep that, make some stipulations in there. Okay, scrolling back. I have to try the zipper technique. My husband's chiming in. Vicky pieced a backing in memory of my mother-in-law. That's awesome. Okay, sheets, we've covered that one. I have one more to show you. Again, very early on in my daily little episodes, I was showing you what I'm working on today, and it was this super brightly colored K-facet vases and bowls. This is a big quilt too, so I'm not going to attempt to unfold it for you, but there's vases and bowls and all these colors, like there's all kinds of colors. There's lavender in it, there's golden yellow somewhere in it. Almost every color under the rainbow is in this quilt. And of course I wanted a backing for it. So again, if I'm gonna go and buy a K-facet fabric, like for example, I thought one of these stone type prints, there's a couple in this line that are less bright colorways. So for example, 2 dark shades of purple. And I thought that would make a really pretty backing. And yes, absolutely it would. But again, going and buying 9 or 10 yards of a K-facet fabric is a significant investment into the quilt. So here's what I chose to do. You can give me your opinion on what I opted for. I went to my stash and I picked all these greens that are kind of related greens, a little bit yellowy green, I guess. And there's no real calicos among them. This is probably the most traditional print, but even that. And what I did is I cut really wide 14-inch strips, and I'm going to piece them this way on my quilt backing, right? So it's just going to be stripe, 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 all the way down from top to bottom. And when I load it on my long arm, I'm going to keep those seams horizontal as well. I didn't even have enough yardage, like it took 3 widths of fabric to get a full stripe across, right? 2 was not enough. And so a couple of them even have more than one print across a stripe. So I'll have a couple of shortish vertical seams, but I think I'll be okay with that. I'll sew them and make sure they're flat and press them well. And that's what I'm gonna do for this quilt. I know that I want to quilt it from side to side already because I'm going to quilt horizontal lines on it. So I did think briefly, and I may still rethink this one. So I'm thinking to myself, okay, if I'm quilting all horizontal lines, and my long seams are horizontal, what if they don't match up perfectly and the stitching line, veers a little bit? The quilting line veers a little bit from the seam line in the back. Will I like the look of that? So I'm gonna have to decide, am I okay with that possible awkwardness on the back side of the quilt? And I intend this quilt to hang on the wall for the most part, so people aren't gonna be looking at the back necessarily. Am I okay with that? Or if I want to avoid that, I would have to put the stripes running top to bottom, and then I would have to deal with them at the long arm with the fact that my seams run vertically and it might be a little more difficult to roll it on smoothly. So one way or the other, again, there's not a right way or a wrong way. I'm trying to think through those variables and just choose the one that I want to do, the way that I want to do it. So, Carol, could you ever use the pieced quilt top on the back so you could quilt the pattern on the backing? I do think you could, Carol, except for the fact that your quilt top does not have any excess fabric, right, to clamp onto your top or bottom rail, or in fact at the sides. So you would have to sew on a border, which would not last, but you would have to baste on some sort of border that would be your clamping apparatus, right? And you'd have to really pay attention to where the, the top and the bottom and the sides of that quilt are to make sure you get the whole top quilted. Does that make sense? And then you would take those leaders off afterwards and you'd have probably an unquilted 1/4 inch at the side, right? So again, it's not that you can't do it, but there's things that you need to think through in the doing of it. You'll probably have to make some concessions in some way to make that work. Mindy, love that idea on your backing. Good, good. Teresa, that'll be beautiful for the back. I think so too. A lot of the greens in the front of the quilt are a bluer green, but there's also some of that yellowy green, and that's what I had the most of on my stash. So I just picked things that I thought played nicely together in that family, and I'm prepared to be satisfied with that for $100, $150 of savings of backing fabric. And so this all came out of my stash, so that's great. I had another idea about backing and it has just slipped my mind. So if you guys have any questions, be typing them in and I'll try and think of what that was before we move on. Let me just scroll back and see if there were any other questions. Oh, I know what I was going to talk about. I don't honestly know that I've posted any pictures on social media, but a couple months back, I quilted a project that was a memory quilt. So someone in my local town made it. A lady had passed away and she had 3 grown children. And so my friend, whose name is Mickey, took all her clothing, right? And she was trying to make 3 quilts out of the clothing. Well, so far I've quilted one of them for her. And Mickey made both the top and the backing out of clothing, 100% out of repurposed clothing. So the top of this particular one was a lot of denim and had a fair bit actually of vinyl in it. And kind of just different fabrics. So some of those seams were really bulky. She put pockets from the jeans, so there were rivets and snaps and embroidery and all these sort of bulky things on the top side. The bottom of the quilt, the backing, is something I had never seen before. And I don't know that Mickey had either. And let me be clear here too. Mickey also long arms, so she totally knew what she was asking for. We conferred about this and I did it willingly. She didn't spring an ugly surprise on me. But the backing she made out of entirely sweatshirt type fabrics. So stretchy, like minky fabric or worse. And she included like pockets. So there were literally double layers and pockets that you could stick your hand into on the back. So this was one of those quilts that I thought through. Would it be easier if I turned it upside down, right? And quilted those pockets from the top where I could see them, where my spoon foot could skate over them. But I had rivets and buttons on the other side. So there was no easy way to do that. So the solution for that one was I didn't actually quilt an edge-to-edge design. I basically tacked it. So much like a tied quilt would have, heavy thread or yarn knotted every so often. Well, not sure what just happened there, sorry. Basically, I still loaded it on my long arm and I did a little round circle, like the size of my hopper foot, like less than ½ an inch. I went around and around and around about 6 times because that secured my ends, did a little close locking stitch and then trimmed it and then went on to the next one. And I did those little tacks, those little almost polka dots all over the quilt at about 5-inch spacing. And in fact, I did not clip my thread between. I stitched one, I moved to the next and I stitched it, moved to the next and stitched it. And after the quilt was all done and unloaded, I took a little razor type seam ripper and just snip, 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 snip those threads, because it's not like a scissors that you have to open, right? You could just hold the thread, rest the razor on both ends. So it only took about 20 minutes to clip all those threads front and back. So that's how I resolved that one. That's the most creative backing I think I've ever done. And it worked well. The result was awesome. It looked like little polka dots from the wrong side. It looked pleasing on the front side. You almost didn't see it because of all the busy denim stuff going on, but it was a really good result. Vanilla Yogurt is saying, it's important to use the same material if you piece the backing to avoid tucks and pleats. Ask me how I know. I mean, yes, although the one I just talked about was an example of very mixed media, but it is certainly more difficult to keep things flat and smooth without a doubt. And Vanilla Yogurt is saying, don't mix cotton and cotton poly. And in general, I agree with that. But again, I always go back to my mom and my grandma's quilting, and they mixed everything. And they still got decent quilts out of it. So I wouldn't say you cannot mix. I would just say it does add to the complexity. It might change the result, you know, in terms of shrinkage or how it washes or even how it wears, because they will wear differently. So be aware, but I won't say you can't do it. Another quilter that I know that mixes media is Victoria Findlay Wolf. Okay, she's recognized. She's a name in the quilting world. She knows what she's talking about. But she has done, for one thing, she's done those double knit polyester fabrics that our grandmas did. She's done quilts out of that. That fabric never dies. But she's also done some of her show quilts that will have linen in them and lace in them and tulle in them and satin in them. And it adds interest and texture, and it's artistic. So just know about the complexities that adds, but never say you can't do it. And I'm going way down rabbit trails, aren't I? But there you go. Karen, if you decide to use stripes as your backing, will you keep 1/4 inch seam allowance or increase it? I'll probably still keep a 1/4 inch seam allowance, Karen, but I will in fact press them open so they lay as flat as possible on that backing, because there will be multiple seams. Joelle, will you use the vase quilt as one of your live and unscripted? It would be fun to see. It really, really would, Joelle. Unfortunately, it's a big quilt, right? It's going to take some hours to quilt. So at best, I will do portions of it, and possibly I'll pre-record them and then air it later so that I could get portions of the beginning, portions of the middle, portions of the end as one episode. You know, again, like I said earlier, if I made everything for YouTube that I have an idea for, that's all I would get done. So I'll try because I agree it would be interesting and it's so bright and fun. Although I don't know how much you will see the quilting on that fabric on camera, so that's a consideration too. I think I've answered the questions. I'm just scrolling to the bottom. Mindy, people used what they had. My grandma even had weird old double knit in some. Yep. Now I will say this, my mom tended to have one or the other in the case of the double knit, because it's entirely a different kettle of fish, and she always tied her double knit ones. They're really thick. You probably could quilt them at a long arm, but she was a hand quilter, so you wouldn't want to be hand quilting through those. You know, she was the 10 to 12 stitches per inch kind of hand quilter. So she didn't hand quilt the double knit. She tied those, and then she hand quilted everything else. So there's that. Okay, you guys, we're at 22 minutes, so we've about exhausted our time. It's been a fun conversation about backings. I thank you so much for commenting. And again, thumbs up if you have enjoyed these episodes. Pretty sure we've been over 30 now, so here's my thinking. Tomorrow is going to be the last for sure and scheduled one. And I'm hoping tomorrow to talk about my favorite auditioning tool for trying out designs, ideas at the long arm. After that, tomorrow afternoon, in fact, I'm flying out to Houston for the Houston Quilt Festival, and I do intend to come to you live a couple times throughout the festival, but I don't know that it will be every day, and I don't know what time it will be. But I'll try and bring some interesting topics to you, or some fun quilts, or our Bernina booth, or whatever I can show you, and bring you a few live episodes throughout the next week. So thanks so much for tuning in. Have a great Saturday, and I will catch up with you tomorrow.